King Leopold's ghost, the Congo Free State atrocities. In May 1904, a British missionary named Alice Seeley Harris photographed a man named Nsala. He was staring down at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter. She had been killed and mutilated by soldiers enforcing a rubber quota her village could not meet. Her name was Boale. This photograph would travel around the world and become one of the first pieces of photographic evidence ever used in a human rights campaign. It was taken in a place called the Congo Free State, a territory 80 times the size of Belgium, owned not by a nation, not by a company, not by a colonial government, but by one man. His name was Leopold II, King of the Belgians. He never set foot in Africa in his life. And yet, historians estimate that under his personal rule, the population of the Congo fell by as many as 10 million people, worked to death, starved, mutilated, or killed outright in the pursuit of rubber, ivory, and the personal fortune of a European monarch who called it, without irony, his civilizing mission. This is the story of how one man turned an entire nation into a private company, how he sold the world a lie of philanthropy while running what a U.S. consul called the most gigantic case of theft, fraud, forgery, oppression, and cruelty in the history of the world, and how a handful of missionaries, journalists, and a shipping clerk named Edmund Morel eventually forced the truth into the light. Too late for millions, but not too late to matter. This is the story of the Congo Free State. Part 1. The Making of a King. To understand the Congo, you first have to understand the man and the country he was born to rule. Belgium, in the mid-19th century, was a young and anxious nation. It had only become independent in 1830, carved out of the Netherlands by revolution and great power diplomacy. It was small, wedged between France, Germany, and Britain, and it had no colonies, no overseas empire, none of the trappings that the other European powers wore as proof of their greatness. For a king with grand ambitions, this was a humiliation. Leopold was born in 1835, the second son of Belgium's first king, Leopold I. From a young age, those who knew him described someone restless, calculating, and consumed by a hunger for grandeur that Belgium itself could never satisfy. As a young prince touring the world, he visited colonies run by other European powers, Dutch holdings in the East Indies, British possessions in India and Ceylon, and came home believing that a nation's greatness was measured by the size of the map painted in its color. He became king in 1865, and almost immediately he began looking for a colony of his own. He tried and failed to buy territory in the Philippines. He explored the idea of colonies in Argentina, in Fiji, in parts of China. Belgium's own parliament wanted nothing to do with any of it. Colonization was expensive, risky, and Belgian voters had little appetite for foreign adventures. So Leopold did something almost without precedent. He decided to acquire a colony, not as King of Belgium, but as a private individual, not for his country, for himself. His eyes settled on Central Africa, a region still largely unmapped by Europeans, its interior a blank space on the maps of the time, fed by rumors of vast wealth in ivory and, later, rubber. In 1876, Leopold hosted an international geographic conference in Brussels, gathering explorers, scientists, and philanthropists under the banner of ending the slave trade and bringing Christianity and commerce to the so-called Dark Continent. He founded the International African Association, presenting himself to the world as a humanitarian patron of exploration, not a land-grabbing monarch. It was, from the very beginning, a public relations operation. Leopold understood something many of his fellow monarchs did not. That empire, in the age of newspapers, needed a story the public could believe in. The man Leopold chose to make that story real was Henry Morton Stanley, the Welsh-American journalist and explorer famous for finding the missing missionary David Livingstone in East Africa. Stanley had crossed the Congo basin from east to west in a grueling, deadly expedition, and he knew the terrain, the rivers, and the people better than almost any other European alive. Leopold hired Stanley in 1879 for a new expedition, this time not one of discovery, but of conquest by paperwork. Over 5 years, Stanley traveled up and down the Congo River, meeting with hundreds of local chiefs and persuading, or tricking, them into signing treaties. Most of these chiefs could not read the French or English text placed in front of them. Many believed they were signing agreements of friendship or trade. In reality, they were signing away sovereignty over their land, their labor, and their resources to a Belgian king they would never meet. By 1884, Stanley had gathered treaties covering roughly 900,000 square miles of Central Africa. Part 2. A Kingdom Built on Paper. The timing could not have been better for Leopold. In 1884 and 1885, the major powers of Europe gathered in Berlin for a conference to settle competing claims in Africa, in what would later be remembered as the starting gun of the scramble for Africa. Not a single African representative was present in the room where the continent's future was decided. Leopold played the diplomacy of this conference brilliantly. He positioned himself not as a rival to Britain, France, or Germany, but as a neutral, humanitarian trustee, someone who could hold Central Africa as a kind of buffer zone, open to free trade for all nations, dedicated to suppressing the Arab Swahili slave trade that still operated in parts of the interior, and committed to the moral and material improvement of the African people who live there. Worked. The other powers, each wary of the others gaining the territory, found it easier to let Leopold have it as a personal possession than to let any rival state claim it. The United States, notably, was the first nation to formally recognize Leopold's claim, followed by the major European powers. On February 5, 1885, the Congo Free State was born, not as a Belgian colony, but as the sovereign personal property of Leopold II. He was its absolute ruler. There was no legislature, no free press, no courts independent of his authority. He owned it the way another man might own a house. The irony was almost grotesque. The state was named Free, ostensibly because it stood for free trade and the freedom of its African inhabitants from slavery and tribal warfare. In practice, it would become one of the most brutal systems of forced labor in modern history, a system many historians consider a form of slavery in all but name. In its first years, The Congo Free State's main export was ivory. Elephant populations were hunted at an unsustainable pace to feed the European demand for piano keys, billiard balls, and decorative carvings. But ivory alone would not make Leopold the fortune he craved, and running the territory, building infrastructure, paying soldiers, administering a colony larger than all of Western Europe, was staggeringly expensive. By the early 1890s, Leopold was pouring his own money into the project and finding it a losing proposition. Then came the invention that would transform the Congo and Leopold's fortunes forever: the pneumatic rubber tire. John Boyd Dunlop's invention in 1888, combined with the rise of the automobile and bicycle industries in the 1890s, sent global demand for rubber skyrocketing. And the Congo basin, it turned out, was carpeted in wild rubber vines. Leopold saw his opportunity. In 1891 and 1892, he issued a series of decrees that would define the horror to come. He declared all vacant land in the Congo, which, by his definition, meant essentially all land not physically occupied by a village at that exact moment, to be the property of the state. Since the state was Leopold, this meant that the ivory and the rubber growing wild on that land now belonged to him personally. Africans were forbidden from selling these resources to anyone but the state or state-licensed concession companies. In effect, with the stroke of a pen, Leopold had made the entire Congolese population trespassers on their own land and had turned the harvesting of rubber into an obligation owed to the crown. Part 3. The Rubber Terror. This is where the story turns from colonial exploitation into something closer to organized mass atrocity. To enforce rubber collection, Leopold relied on a private army called the Force Publique, a force of roughly 19,000 men by the early 1900s, commanded by European officers, but overwhelmingly made up of African soldiers, many of them conscripted, some of them former slaves themselves, others recruited from ethnic groups the administration deliberately used against rival communities. The system worked like this. Each village was assigned a rubber quota based on what colonial officials believed the surrounding forest could yield. Men were forced to leave their fields and fishing grounds, sometimes for weeks at a time, and venture deep into the forest to tap wild rubber vines. The work itself was punishing. Rubber vines don't yield the way a plantation crop does. Workers had to cut the vine, coat their bodies in the raw latex, then peel it off, a process that was excruciating and, over time, damaged the skin. As the easily accessible vines near villages were exhausted, men had to travel farther and farther, sometimes days into the forest, leaving their villages without labor for planting or hunting. Quotas were non-negotiable and quantities were often physically impossible to meet. And the consequence for failure was not a fine or a warning. It was violence. Force Publique officers and their African soldiers, known as sentries, were stationed in villages to enforce collection. When a village failed to deliver its quota, punishment followed a horrifyingly consistent pattern across the territory. Soldiers would burn villages, take hostages, often women and children, chain them, and hold them until the men returned with rubber. Flogging with a whip made of dried, knotted hippopotamus hide, called the shikot, was so routine that observers described it as background noise of daily life in the Congo. A prescribed light punishment might be 25 lashes. The reality, witnesses recorded, was often far higher, sometimes over 100, frequently fatal. And then there is the detail that has come to define the Congo Free State more than any other: the severed hands. Forced public soldiers were issued a strictly limited number of bullets and were required to account for every cartridge fired, ostensibly to prevent them from hoarding ammunition or selling it. To prove that a bullet had been used to kill an enemy, but rather than, say, used for hunting or simply wasted, soldiers were ordered to bring back the right hand of anyone they killed as evidence. This system created a monstrous incentive. Soldiers who missed their target, or who used bullets for other purposes, or who simply wanted to inflate their kill counts to please their officers, began cutting the hands off the living as well as the dead, sometimes off villagers who had nothing to do with any resistance at all, simply to make their basket of hands match their spent cartridges. There are documented cases of soldiers smoking hands over fires to preserve them for the journey back to a post for counting. Baskets of severed hands presented to European officers as proof of productive campaigns became one of the defining images of the entire system, and eventually one of the pieces of evidence that broke the story open to the outside world. Estimates of the death toll from this period vary enormously, and historians continue to debate the numbers precisely because Leopold's administration kept incomplete records and had every incentive to hide the truth. The most widely cited figure from historian Adam Hochschild and demographic studies conducted by Belgian scholar Jan van Sina and others suggests that the population of the Congo may have fallen by as much as half between 1880 and 1920, a toll historians estimate at around 10 million people, through a combination of direct killing, starvation caused by disrupted agriculture, exhaustion from forced labor, disease spread by the disruption of normal life, and a catastrophic collapse in the birth rate as families were torn apart by the hostage system and forced labor. No one will ever have an exact number. What is not disputed by any serious historian is that this was a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, deliberately engineered for the profit of one man. Part 4. The Machinery of Denial. While this was happening in Central Africa, Leopold was quite literally building his legacy in stone back home. The profits from Congolese rubber and ivory, funneled through Leopold's private accounts and shell entities rather than the Belgian treasury, financed an extraordinary building spree in Belgium, the Cinquantenaire Arch in Brussels, the renovation of the royal palace at Laeken and its greenhouses, museums, parks, grand boulevards. Leopold became known to Belgians of his era as the Builder King, celebrated for beautifying the capital, most of them unaware, or unwilling to ask too closely, where the money had actually come from. He also constructed a museum specifically to showcase the Congo to the Belgian public. The Royal Museum for Central Africa at Tervuren opened in the early 1900s, complete with a human zoo exhibit in 1897, in which Congolese people were displayed to European visitors as living exhibits. It was propaganda dressed as education, proof to ordinary Belgians that their king's colonial project was a benevolent, civilizing one. At the same time, Leopold maintained an extraordinarily sophisticated public relations operation abroad. He employed journalists, lobbyists, and lawyers in London, Paris, and Washington to place favorable stories, discredit critics, and lobby politicians. He funded sympathetic books and academic studies. He cultivated relationships with American politicians and journalists specifically because he understood the value of U.S. recognition and goodwill. For years, this machine worked. Most Europeans and Americans who had opinions about the Congo Free State at all believed what Leopold's propaganda told them, that this was a humanitarian project, suppressing slavery, spreading Christianity, and bringing the light of civilization to a supposedly backward part of the world. The truth was almost the exact opposite of the story he sold. The system Leopold built didn't suppress slavery. In crucial respects, it was a new and even more industrialized form of it, one where an entire population's labor was extracted under threat of mutilation and death for a commodity destined for European drawing rooms and American factories. Part 5. The Whistleblowers. The truth did not stay buried forever. It came out because a small, determined, and unlikely group of people refused to let it. One of the earliest voices was an African-American historian and journalist named George Washington Williams. In 1890, Williams traveled to the Congo hoping to see Leopold's civilizing mission for himself. Having initially been sympathetic to the project, what he found appalled him. He wrote an open letter to Leopold, the first major public document to accuse the Congo Free State administration of forced labor, mutilation, and killing on a mass scale. Williams died in 1891, only a year later, and his findings were largely ignored at the time by a world not yet ready to hear them. But he had planted the first flag. The breakthrough in exposing the atrocities to a mass audience came through photography and through Christian missionaries stationed in the Congo, particularly those of the Congo Bololo Mission and the American Baptist Missionary Union. Missionaries like Alice Seeley Harris and her husband John Harris photographed mutilated survivors, burned villages, and the aftermath of punitive raids, and smuggled these images out of the territory. Because a photograph, unlike a written report, was very difficult for Leopold's propaganda machine to simply deny. Alice Harris's photographs, including the image of Insala and his daughter's hand and foot that opened this documentary, were turned into magic lantern slideshows and toured through churches and public halls across Britain and the United States, shocking audiences who had never seen anything like it. But the man most responsible for turning missionary reports and photographs into an organized international campaign was a British shipping company clerk named Edmund Dean Morrell. Morrell worked for a shipping line that carried cargo between Belgium and the Congo. Going through the manifests as part of his job, he noticed something that didn't add up. Ships were arriving in Antwerp from the Congo, loaded with immensely valuable cargoes of rubber and ivory, while the ships heading back to the Congo carried mostly guns, ammunition, and chains, not the trade goods, wages, or payment you would expect if this were genuine commerce. Morel realized what he was looking at was not trade at all. It was extraction backed by force. Goods were coming out. Nothing of comparable value was going in. The only explanation was that the rubber and ivory were being taken, not bought. Morel quit his job and devoted the rest of his life to exposing the Congo Free State. In 1904, alongside the human rights campaigner E.D. Morel and others, he founded the Congo Reform Association, which became the first mass-mobilized international human rights campaign in modern history, predating, and in many ways, serving as the template for human rights movements of the century that followed. He published pamphlets, gave lectures across Britain and the United States, and rallied prominent writers and public figures to the cause, including the author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote a widely read book on the subject, and Mark Twain, whose scathing 1905 satire King Leopold's Soliloquy mocked the king's public claims of philanthropy by putting damning facts in Leopold's own imagined voice. Partly due to Morel's pressure and partly due to its own strategic interests in the region, sent a career diplomat named Roger Casement to investigate conditions in the Congo firsthand in 1903. Casement, who would later become a controversial figure in his own right as an Irish nationalist executed by Britain in 1916, produced a meticulous, devastating official report in 1904, corroborating the missionary accounts with detailed eyewitness testimony, interviews with survivors, and first-hand observation of mutilated villagers. The Casement Report, published by the British government, could not be dismissed by Leopold's PR machine as missionary exaggeration or commercial rival slander, in the way earlier accusations had been. It was an official diplomatic document, and it landed like a bomb. An African-American missionary, William Shepherd, working independently in the Kasai region, documented similar atrocities committed by the Kasai Rubber Company, a Leopold-chartered concession, including first-hand accounts and physical evidence of mutilation that he published and for which he was later sued for libel by the company, a trial he ultimately won, further validating the accusations circulating in the international press. By the mid-1900s, Leopold's carefully built reputation as a humanitarian king was collapsing under the weight of photographic evidence, missionary testimony, and official diplomatic reports that all told the same story, independently corroborating one another from different parts of the territory. Part 6. The End of the Free State. Leopold fought the growing scandal with everything he had. He commissioned his own Commission of Inquiry in 1904, likely expecting a whitewash. But even his hand-picked commissioners, after touring the territory and interviewing witnesses, largely corroborated the accusations of systemic violence, confirming that the abuses documented by missionaries and Casement were not isolated incidents, but the predictable result of the quota and hostage system itself. The political ground was shifting beneath him. The British government, the United States, and other powers began openly discussing intervention. Within Belgium itself, a growing movement of socialists, liberals, and Catholic reformers demanded that Parliament strip Leopold of his personal control and annex the territory as a proper Belgian colony, subject to at least nominal parliamentary oversight. Leopold resisted for years, using every legal and political maneuver available to him, but by 1908, facing overwhelming international and domestic pressure, and reportedly having already siphoned off much of the personal fortune he'd extracted, some of which he spent lavishly, including on a young mistress decades his junior. He agreed to sell the Congo Free State to the Belgian government. Belgium paid Leopold a substantial sum for a territory that was, by any legal or moral standard, not his to sell in the first place, having been built on stolen land and stolen labor. The Congo Free State formally ceased to exist on November 15, 1908, becoming the Belgian Congo, a state colony, no longer the private property of one man. 1908. It's worth being precise about what this transfer did and did not fix. The worst excesses of the personal rule era, the hostage-taking, the systematic mutilation, the very worst of the quota terror, did decline under direct Belgian state administration, partly due to continued international scrutiny and partly due to reforms enacted under pressure. But forced labor, racial hierarchy, and colonial exploitation did not end in 1908. They continued, in modified forms, for another half-century until Congolese independence in 1960. The change of ownership was a reduction in the worst atrocities, not a moral reckoning. Leopold himself died less than a year later, in December 1909, having never visited the territory that bore his name in infamy, never expressing public remorse, and having ordered the destruction of much of the Congo Free State's administrative archive in the months before the handover, an act widely understood by historians as a deliberate attempt to erase the paper trail of what had been done in his name. He reportedly told an aide regarding the records, "I will give them my Congo, but they have no right to know what I did there." Part 7. Legacy and Memory. For most of the 20th century, the full scale of what happened in the Congo Free State remained strangely absent from mainstream Western historical memory, overshadowed in the European imagination by the two world wars, and actively suppressed in Belgium itself, where school textbooks for generations either omitted the atrocities entirely or described the era in the same paternalistic, civilizing language Leopold's own propaganda had used. That began to change significantly with the 1998 publication of Adam Hochschild's book, King Leopold's Ghost, which synthesized decades of scattered historical research, including the work of Belgian historian Jules Marchal, a former diplomat who spent years painstakingly documenting the death toll using colonial administrative records into a single, widely read narrative that finally brought the scale of the Congo Free State's crimes to a mass international audience nearly a century after they occurred. In the decades since, Belgium has begun, slowly and often reluctantly, to reckon with this history. Statues of Leopold II have been vandalized, removed, or placed in museum contexts with added historical framing in cities across Belgium, particularly following the global protests of 2020. In 2020, Belgium's King Philippe, Leopold's descendant, expressed for the first time by a reigning Belgian monarch regret for the acts of violence and cruelty committed during the colonial period, though critics noted the statement stopped short of a formal apology. The Royal Museum for Central Africa at Tervuren, once a monument to colonial propaganda, has undergone a significant renovation and reframing to present a far more critical account of its own founding purpose. But for the Democratic Republic of Congo itself, this history is not simply a matter of statues and museum plaques. Many historians and Congolese scholars argue that the extractive, violent template established under Leopold, a system built to funnel the country's mineral and resource wealth outward for the benefit of foreign powers and corporations, with minimal reinvestment in the people living on top of that wealth, set patterns that would echo through the Belgian Congo's colonial administration, through the chaos of the country's 1960 independence and the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, through the decades of Mobutu Sese Seko's kleptocratic rule, and arguably continue to shape the conflict-driven extraction of cobalt, coltan, and other minerals from the Congo today. Resources now essential to the smartphones and electric vehicles of the very same global economy. Closing. Insala, the man in that 1904 photograph, survived. His daughter Boali did not. We don't know much else about the rest of his life, whether he had other children, whether he lived to see the Congo Free State dissolved, whether he ever learned that his photograph, taken by a missionary with a borrowed camera, would end up being shown in churches and lecture halls thousands of miles away, helping to build the pressure that eventually forced a king to give up his private kingdom. What we do know is this. For over 20 years, one of the wealthiest and most celebrated monarchs in Europe ran a system of forced labor, hostage-taking, and mutilation across a territory 80 times the size of his own country, extracted a fortune from it, spent that fortune building the boulevards and palaces that still stand in Brussels today, and told the world the entire time that he was doing it out of love for the African people. Millions of people paid for that lie with their lives. It took photographs, missionary testimony, a shipping clerk's suspicion about cargo manifests, and years of organized public pressure to make the world stop believing it. The Congo Free State no longer exists. The Democratic Republic of Congo does, a nation still living, in more ways than one, in the shadow of the fortune that was taken from it. This has been King Leopold's Ghost. If you found this history important, consider sharing it, because for 100 years this story was almost successfully buried. And never forget to subscribe and turn on your notification bell button for more erased history.